My name is Elijah Carter, and I've spent my entire career being underestimated. At 32 years old, I hold a PhD in chemical engineering from MIT, 3 patents in sustainable polymer compounds, and enough professional accolades to fill a small room. But none of that matters when I walk into a boardroom and watch the surprise flicker across white faces, the subtle shift in posture, the quick glance between colleagues that says, "Him, really?" I joined Meridian Chemical Solutions 4 years ago as a senior research scientist. The position was supposed to be a stepping stone to something greater, Director of Innovation, maybe even VP of Research and Development. I had the credentials. I had the results. What I didn't have was the right skin color for the corner office. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I arrived at 7:15 a.m., 45 minutes before most of my colleagues, because I'd learned early that a black man in corporate America needs to be first in and last out just to be considered adequate. The security guard, a young white kid named Tommy, who'd been working the front desk for 3 months, still asked to see my badge every single morning. Meanwhile, he waved through white employees he'd never even met. "Morning, Dr. Carter," he said, barely glancing at my credentials before handing them back. Progress, I suppose. I made my way to the R&D wing, passing the executive floor with its glass walls and panoramic city views. That's where the real decisions happened. Decisions made by people who'd never spent a day in a lab, who couldn't tell you the difference between a polymer chain and a bicycle chain. But they wore expensive suits and had the right last names, so they got to decide the future of chemical innovation. My lab was on the 3rd floor, tucked away in a corner that most executives had never visited. That was fine by me. I did my best work in solitude, away from the politics and the posturing. My current project, a biodegradable polymer compound that could revolutionize sustainable packaging, was 18 months in the making. I'd developed the initial formula on my own time, using my own resources, before bringing it to Meridian. The company had agreed to fund further development in exchange for licensing rights. But I'd retained the patent. My lawyer, a sharp black woman named Patricia Williams, who'd seen too many brilliant black inventors get robbed of their life's work, had insisted on that clause. "Trust me," she'd said, sliding the contract across her desk. "You'll thank me later." I didn't know how prophetic those words would prove to be. By 8:30 a.m., the lab was buzzing with activity. My team consisted of 4 researchers, 2 white men in their 40s who'd been with the company for decades, a young Asian woman fresh out of her postdoc, and myself. I was technically the senior scientist, but you'd never know it from the way Bradley Thornton and Kevin Mitchell treated me. "Elijah, did you get a chance to look at those spectroscopy results?" Bradley asked, not bothering to look up from his computer. He never called me Dr. Carter, despite knowing I had more advanced degrees than he ever would. Meanwhile, he insisted everyone address him as Dr. Thornton, even though his doctorate was honorary, awarded by a small college after a generous donation from his family's foundation. "I reviewed them last night," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "There's an anomaly in the 3rd sample set. I think we need to recalibrate the equipment and run the tests again." Bradley finally looked up, his expression skeptical. "Are you sure? I checked those results myself. They looked fine to me." This was a familiar dance. Bradley questioning my analysis, despite my expertise far exceeding his. Kevin would usually chime in with support for whatever Bradley said, and I'd have to spend the next hour defending conclusions that should have been self-evident to anyone with basic training in spectroscopy. "I'm sure," I said firmly. "The peaks at 1650 and 1550 wave numbers are inconsistent with what we'd expect from the polymer structure. Either there's contamination in the sample or the equipment needs maintenance." Dr. Sarah Chen, the postdoc, spoke up. "I noticed that too, actually. I was going to mention it in this morning's meeting." Bradley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He didn't like being contradicted, especially not by a woman and a black man in the same conversation. Fine, we'll recalibrate. But this is going to set us back at least a day. Better to be accurate than fast, I replied. The morning meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the main conference room. These weekly gatherings were supposed to be opportunities for cross-departmental collaboration, but they usually devolved into executives congratulating themselves while researchers like me sat in silence. Today, however, there was electricity in the air. Rumors had been swirling for weeks about a major acquisition. And word was that the CEO himself would be making an announcement. I took my usual seat at the back of the room, next to Sarah. The executives filed in, a parade of navy suits and confident smiles. And then came Richard Harrington III. Harrington was the kind of man who'd been born on third base and spent his life convinced he'd hit a triple. His grandfather had founded Meridian Chemical Solutions in 1952. His father had expanded it into a national powerhouse, and now Richard was determined to take the company global. He was 53 years old, silver-haired, and possessed the particular brand of arrogance that comes from never being told no. He also couldn't stand me. I'd realized this during my first week at Meridian, when I'd corrected a factual error he'd made during a presentation to the board. The polymer degradation rates he'd cited were wrong, off by a factor of 3, and I'd thought he'd want to know before he embarrassed himself in front of investors. Instead, he'd looked at me like I'd just tracked mud across his grandmother's Persian rug. "Thank you for your input," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But I think I know my own company's products." He'd been wrong, of course. The investors had discovered the error 3 months later, and the stock had taken a hit. But somehow that became my fault too, the black scientist who'd undermined leadership by speaking up. Now, as Harrington took his place at the head of the conference table, I felt his gaze sweep across the room and pause, almost imperceptibly, when it reached me. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a politician at a fundraiser. "I'm sure you've all heard the rumors, so let me put them to rest. Meridian Chemical Solutions is about to enter a new era." He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him illuminated with a corporate logo I didn't recognize. GreenTech Industries. "As of next month, we'll be finalizing our acquisition of GreenTech, a leading innovator in sustainable packaging solutions. This positions Meridian at the forefront of the green chemistry revolution." Murmurs rippled through the room. Sustainable packaging was my domain, the very thing I'd been working on for the past 18 months. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. Harrington continued, his smile widening. "GreenTech has developed a proprietary polymer compound that's generating significant interest from major retailers. Once we complete the acquisition, we'll have exclusive rights to this technology." I knew about GreenTech. Everyone in sustainable chemistry knew about them. They'd been making waves with a biodegradable polymer that showed promising results in early testing. What most people didn't know, what Harrington clearly didn't know, was that their proprietary compound was derived from research I'd published 3 years ago. Research that had formed the foundation of my own patent. My hands were steady as I raised one. "Mr. Harrington, can you tell us more about the specific technology GreenTech has developed?" The CEO's smile flickered just for a moment. "I don't think the technical details are relevant to this announcement." Dr. Carter," I said evenly, "and I ask because I've been working on sustainable polymer compounds for the past 18 months. I'd like to understand how the GreenTech acquisition will affect our current research." Several heads turned in my direction. Bradley was smirking. Kevin was shaking his head slightly. As if I'd just committed a serious faux pas. Harrington's expression hardened. "Dr. Carter, I appreciate your enthusiasm, But your role here is to execute the company's research agenda, not to question strategic decisions made at the executive level. Perhaps we can discuss your concerns after the meeting if you feel that's truly necessary." The dismissal was clear and pointed. A few people chuckled nervously. I felt the heat rising in my chest, but I kept my face neutral. "Of course, Mr. Harrington. I look forward to that conversation." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of financial projections and self-congratulation. But I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was racing, connecting dots that formed an increasingly disturbing picture. After the meeting, I returned to my lab and pulled up the GreenTech patent filings. What I found confirmed my suspicions. Their lead compound, the one Harrington was so excited about, used a molecular structure that was nearly identical to the formula I'd patented 2 years ago. Either GreenTech had independently developed the same technology, virtually impossible given the specific innovations involved, or they'd built their product using my intellectual property without permission. Either way, Meridian was about to spend $300 million acquiring a company whose flagship product might be legally worthless. I should have been angry. Part of me was. But a larger part, the part that had learned to survive in spaces that weren't built for people who looked like me, was already calculating. Because if I was right, I wasn't just a researcher with a legitimate grievance. I was the one person who could save this company from a catastrophic mistake. Or destroy it completely. The choice, I realized, was mine. The next 3 weeks were an exercise in controlled patience. I went to work every day, ran my experiments, attended my meetings, and smiled at colleagues who looked through me like I was invisible. But beneath that calm exterior, I was building a case. The first step was confirming my suspicions about GreenTech. I spent evenings poring over their patent filings, comparing molecular structures and synthesis pathways to my own work. The similarities were too specific to be coincidental. Someone at GreenTech had accessed my published research, possibly even my confidential submissions to the company, and reverse-engineered my polymer compound. I documented everything: dates, formulas, email timestamps. Patricia had taught me well. In any legal battle, the paper trail is everything. The second step was understanding exactly how deep this went. That meant getting access to information above my pay grade, communications between Meridian executives and GreenTech leadership. Due diligence reports, financial projections, the kind of material that someone in my small role would never see. But here's the thing about being underestimated. People get careless around you. They say things they shouldn't, leave documents on printers they shouldn't, CC email chains they shouldn't. When you're considered furniture, you see everything. It started with a conversation I overheard in the break room. Charles Worthington, the CFO, was talking to Jennifer Blake, VP of Legal, about the acquisition timeline. The due diligence team flagged some concerns about GreenTech's IP portfolio, Jennifer was saying, her voice low. There are some irregularities. Charles waved dismissively. Richard doesn't want to hear about irregularities. He wants this deal done by Q3. Just make sure everything's clean on paper. But if there's a legitimate patent conflict, then we deal with it after the acquisition. These things happen all the time. We have lawyers. That's what we pay them for. I filed that conversation away, adding it to my growing collection of red flags. But I needed more. I needed proof that the decision-makers knew about the potential IP issues and chose to ignore them. The opportunity came 2 weeks later. During the company's annual innovation showcase, every department was required to present their current projects to the executive team and the board of directors. It was supposed to be a celebration of Meridian's research capabilities, but everyone knew it was really about justifying budgets and competing for resources. My team's presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. I'd prepared a comprehensive overview of our sustainable polymer research, Carefully edited, of course, to avoid revealing anything that might compromise my patent position. Bradley had insisted on leading the presentation himself, despite the fact that most of the work was mine. I'd let him. I had bigger concerns. The morning sessions were dedicated to the strategic initiatives, including a detailed presentation on the GreenTech acquisition. I wasn't supposed to be there. Researchers weren't typically invited to board-level presentations, but I'd learned that the IT department had set up a live stream for transparency purposes. The stream was supposed to be password protected, but the password was the company's founding year, 1952. They really should have hired better IT people. I watched from my lab, the presentation playing on my second monitor while I pretended to work on data analysis. Harrington was in his element, painting a picture of synergy and market dominance. The board members nodded along, their expressions a mix of boredom and greed. And then came the slide that changed everything. "As you can see," Harrington said, gesturing to a chemical diagram that made my blood run cold, GreenTech's BioClear compound represents a breakthrough in sustainable polymer technology. Our analysis suggests this will be the industry standard within 5 years. The diagram on the screen was my formula. Not similar to my formula, my exact formula, with one minor modification that didn't affect the fundamental mechanism. Someone had taken my patented work and built a $300 million company on it. I expected rage. What I felt instead was a strange calm, the clarity that comes when you finally see the whole picture. These people had stolen from me. They'd built their empires on the backs of people like me, then mocked us for not achieving more. And now they were about to hand me the weapon I needed to bring it all crashing down. I screenshot the presentation slide and added it to my file. The Innovation Showcase that afternoon was a masterclass in corporate hypocrisy. Bradley presented our research, my research, as if he'd developed it himself. He stumbled over the technical explanations, mangled the terminology, and at one point attributed a key breakthrough to collaborative team effort, rather than naming me specifically. Harrington was in the audience, along with several board members. After Bradley finished his fumbling presentation, the CEO stood up with a patronizing smile. "Very impressive work from the R&D team," he said, "though I have to ask, how does this compare to the BioClear compound from GreenTech? From what I understand, they've already achieved commercial viability while we're still in the research phase. The question was designed to diminish us, to justify the acquisition by making our internal efforts look inadequate." Bradley, predictably, had no good answer. He mumbled something about different applications and market segments. I raised my hand. Harrington's expression soured immediately. "Yes, Dr. Carter. I'd be happy to address that comparison," I said, standing. "The molecular structures are actually quite similar. In fact, someone with expertise in this area might notice that the BioClear compound appears to be derived from foundational research published several years ago, research that's protected by existing patents." The room went quiet. Harrington's smile didn't waver, but I saw something shift behind his eyes. Wariness, maybe, or the first flicker of fear. "That's an interesting observation," he said carefully, "but I'm sure our legal team has thoroughly vetted all IP considerations." "I'm sure they have," I replied. "I just think it's worth noting." For the record, after the showcase, I received an email from Jennifer Blake requesting a meeting. The subject line read, "Discussion re-IP concerns." It was scheduled for the following Monday, in her office on the executive floor. I knew what this was. They were going to try to manage me, to assess how much I knew and how much of a threat I posed. The smart play would be to feign ignorance, to pretend my comment had been an innocent observation rather than a calculated move. But I was done playing their game. I spent the weekend preparing. I organized my documentation into a comprehensive file. Patent certificates, publication dates, Molecular comparisons, screenshots of internal communications, notes from overheard conversations. I contacted Patricia and updated her on the situation. She listened without interruption, then let out a long whistle. Elijah, if what you're telling me is accurate, you've got them dead to rights. But you need to be careful. These people have resources, they'll fight dirty. I know. What's your end game here? A settlement? Your job back with better terms? I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. Money would be nice. Lord knows I'd earned it. But there was something else I wanted. Something that couldn't be quantified in dollars. I want them to know, I said. I want them to understand exactly who they stepped on, and exactly what it cost them. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's not the safe play. No, it's not. But I understand. I heard her smile through the phone. Let's burn it down. Monday morning arrived grey and cold. I dressed carefully, my best suit, a deep navy that Patricia said projected quiet authority. I reviewed my materials one final time, then made my way to the executive floor. Jennifer Blake's office was all glass and chrome, designed to intimidate. She was waiting with Charles Worthington and a man I didn't recognize, probably outside counsel. They gestured me to a seat across from them, a configuration that put me facing 3 adversaries with my back to the door. Classic power play. I'd expected nothing less. Dr. Carter, Jennifer began, her tone professionally warm. Thank you for making time to meet with us. We wanted to follow up on the comments you made during the Innovation Showcase. Of course, I said. I'm happy to clarify. We're concerned, Charles interjected, that your comments might have created some confusion among the board members. The Green Tech acquisition is a strategically important initiative, and we can't have employees, even well-meaning ones, raising unfounded concerns. I understand, though I'd push back on the characterization of my concerns as unfounded. The 3 exchanged glances. Jennifer leaned forward. What exactly are you alleging, Dr. Carter? I'd rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times. I could have played it safe, walked it back, protected my position. Instead, I opened my briefcase and withdrew a folder containing everything I'd compiled. I'm alleging, I said calmly, that GreenTech's BioClear compound is derived from my patented research. I'm alleging that someone at GreenTech, or possibly someone at Meridian, accessed my intellectual property without authorization and used it to develop a competing product. And I'm alleging that the executive team has been made aware of potential IP conflicts and has chosen to proceed with the acquisition anyway. I placed the folder on Jennifer's desk. This contains my evidence, patent certificates, molecular comparisons, time-stamps and documentation of internal communications that suggest willful disregard of due diligence concerns. I've also retained copies with my attorney. The silence that followed was the most satisfying moment of my professional life. Charles had gone pale. Jennifer was flipping through the folder with increasingly frantic movements. The outside counsel was already typing something on his phone, probably an urgent message to his firm. Finally, Jennifer looked up. Dr. Carter, I'm sure we can find a resolution that works for everyone. There's no need to escalate this externally. I stood up. I'll give you until the end of the week to come back with a proposal. After that, my attorney will be filing a formal complaint with the USPTO, and I'll be reaching out to several journalists who've expressed interest in stories about corporate intellectual property theft. I walked out without looking back. The week that followed was a masterpiece of corporate panic that I observed with quiet satisfaction. Emergency meetings were convened. Outside, lawyers descended on the executive floor like vultures circling wounded prey. Richard Harrington III, who usually strolled through the hallways with the confidence of a man who owned the world, was conspicuously absent. I continued going to work, performing my duties with impeccable professionalism. Bradley and Kevin avoided eye contact. Sarah Chen, who'd figured out something significant was happening, brought me coffee one morning and simply said, "Whatever you're doing, I hope you win." On Wednesday, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was male, southern accented and deeply agitated. "Dr. Carter, this is William Ashby. I'm the CEO of Green Tech Industries." I let the silence stretch before responding. "Mr. Ashby, how can I help you? I think you know why I'm calling. I've just spent 2 hours with my legal team reviewing the documents that Meridian shared with us." "The documents you provided. And?" Another long pause. "We need to talk, in person, without lawyers." I agreed to meet him the following day, at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Midtown, far from both companies' headquarters. When I arrived, Ashby was already there, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. He was older than I'd expected, late 60s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in manufacturing before transitioning to the executive suite. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down. "I know you don't owe me anything." "I don't," I agreed him, "but I'm curious what you have to say." Ashby wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, staring at the table. "I built Green Tech from nothing, 30 years in the chemical industry, most of them as a plant manager. When I started this company, I wanted to do something good, to prove that sustainable manufacturing could be profitable." "That's admirable," I said neutrally. "The BioClear formula." He shook his head. "I didn't develop it myself. I'm not a chemist. I hired a team, gave them resources, trusted them to do the work right. 3 years ago, they came to me with a breakthrough, said they'd cracked the code on biodegradable polymers." "And you didn't ask where the breakthrough came from?" Ashby's jaw tightened. I asked. They showed me their research, their lab notebooks, their development timeline. Everything looked legitimate. I had no reason to think that they'd stolen it from a black scientist nobody was paying attention to. The words hung in the air between us. Ashby met my eyes for the first time. And I saw something there that surprised me, genuine shame. "I reviewed your patent last night," he said quietly. "The publication date, the molecular structure, the synthesis pathway. It's all there, clear as day. My people didn't create anything new. They took your work and modified it just enough to claim it as their own." "Yes, they did." "I'm sorry," Ashby's voice cracked. "I know that doesn't mean much, but I need you to understand. I didn't know. And as soon as I found out, He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. "I'm withdrawing from the Meridian acquisition, effective immediately." I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter addressed to the Green Tech Board of Directors, announcing Ashby's resignation as CEO and his recommendation that the company enter immediate negotiations with me regarding licensing rights to my patent. "I'm 68 years old," Ashby said. "I've got more money than I can spend in whatever time I have left. What I don't have is a legacy I can be proud of. If Green Tech's success was built on stolen work, on your stolen work, then it isn't success at all. It's fraud." I stared at the letter for a long moment. This wasn't the confrontation I'd expected. I'd prepared for legal warfare, for corporate bullying, for every dirty trick in the book. I hadn't prepared for a man who looked at the truth and chose to accept it. "What happens to your company?" I asked. "Without BioClear, we don't have much. Maybe we survive. Maybe we don't. But that's not your problem." Ashby stood up, leaving his coffee untouched. "For what it's worth, Dr. Carter, I hope you get everything you deserve. This country has taken enough from people like you." He walked out, leaving me alone with an envelope that had just changed everything. The fallout was swift and spectacular. Green Tech's withdrawal from the acquisition sent shockwaves through the industry. Financial analysts scrambled to understand what had happened. Meridian's stock dropped 12% in a single day. The board of directors convened an emergency session, and by Friday morning, Richard Harrington III had been removed from his position as CEO to pursue other opportunities. I learned this from the company-wide email that went out at 9 a.m., sent by Charles Worthington, who'd been appointed interim CEO. The message was carefully worded to avoid any admission of wrongdoing, but the subtext was clear. The king had fallen, and everyone was rushing to distance themselves from his failures. What the email didn't mention was the meeting I'd had with the board 2 days earlier. Jennifer Blake had arranged it, her tone considerably more respectful than during our first conversation. The board wanted to explore a resolution that would benefit all parties. I'd walked into that meeting with Patricia by my side and a very clear understanding of my leverage. The board members, 8 white men and 2 white women who'd spent their careers in corporate boardrooms, looked at me like I was an equation they couldn't solve. The chairman, a patrician gentleman named Robert Caldwell, spoke first. "Dr. Carter, I want to begin by apologizing. On behalf of the entire board, the situation that has developed is unacceptable. We should have been more diligent in our oversight." "Yes," I agreed, "you should have. We understand you have legitimate grievances, legitimate claims. We're prepared to make this right." "I'm listening." What followed was 2 hours of negotiation that Patricia handled with surgical precision. The board's initial offer, a cash settlement and a promotion to a newly created position with no real authority, was rejected immediately. Their second offer, a larger settlement plus royalties on any products derived from my patent, was closer, but still insufficient. "What exactly do you want, Dr. Carter?" Caldwell finally asked, frustration creeping into his voice. I leaned forward. "I want acknowledgement. Public acknowledgement that my intellectual property was used without authorization. I want a formal apology from this board, issued in a press release. I want full control over all research related to my patent, with appropriate compensation and credit. I want a seat on this board, with voting rights, and I want Richard Harrington III to never work in this industry again." The room erupted. Board members spoke over each other, some outraged, some calculating. Caldwell raised his hand for silence. "That's an extensive list. It's what I'm owed." Patricia added, "My client is also prepared to take this matter to court if necessary. Discovery would be quite illuminating, I imagine. Internal communications, deposition testimony. I suspect there are several people in this room who would prefer to avoid that scrutiny." The threat landed exactly as intended. I watched the calculation happen in real time, the board members weighing the cost of fighting me against the cost of giving me what I wanted. The math, I knew, was heavily in my favor. Caldwell cleared his throat. "We'll need time to discuss this among ourselves." "Of course," I said. "You have until Monday." They agreed to everything. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after Richard Harrington had stood in that conference room and mocked my small role. The press release was carefully worded but unambiguous. Meridian Chemical Solutions acknowledged that research developed by Dr. Elijah Carter had been used inappropriately by a former acquisition target, apologized for any harm caused, and announced a comprehensive settlement, including Dr. Carter's appointment to the company's board of directors and his elevation to Chief Innovation Officer. The industry press went wild. "Black Scientist Exposes Corporate IP Theft," read one headline. "Meridian CEO Ousted After Patent Scandal," read another. My inbox flooded with interview requests, speaking invitations, and messages from fellow black scientists who'd experienced similar treatment. One email stood out. It was from a young man named Marcus Williams, a chemical engineering student at Howard University. "Dr. Carter," he wrote, "I read about what you did. I'm 22 years old, and I've already been told 100 times that there's no place for people like us at the top of this industry, that we should be grateful for whatever scraps they throw us. But you proved them wrong. You didn't just survive, you won, on your terms. Thank you for showing me what's possible. I read that email 3 times before closing my laptop. The final confrontation happened by accident. 3 weeks after the announcement, I was walking through the executive floor, my floor now, when I turned a corner and came face to face with Richard Harrington III. He looked diminished, smaller somehow, without the armor of his position. His suit was still expensive, but it hung on him like it belonged to someone else. He'd come back, I learned later, to collect personal items from his former office. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The hallway was empty. Just the 2 of us and years of accumulated contempt. "Carter," he finally said. Not Dr. Carter, not even Elijah. Just my last name, spat out like something bitter. "Mr. Harrington." His jaw worked silently for a moment. "You think you've won something. You think this changes anything, but people like you." He stopped himself, aware even in his diminished state that there were words he couldn't unsay. "People like me what?" I asked quietly. "Nothing." He looked away. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," I said. "It's always mattered. You just never had to care before." I stepped past him, continuing down the hallway toward my new office. Behind me, I heard him say something under his breath. Probably an insult, probably a slur, probably exactly what he'd been thinking about me since the day I'd first corrected him in that boardroom 4 years ago. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The view from the corner office was everything I'd imagined it would be. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the morning light streaming in like a promise. I sat in the chair that had belonged to executives for decades, men who'd built their empires on the backs of people they considered beneath them, who'd climbed ladders built from the broken dreams of those they'd stepped on. The chair fit perfectly. On my desk was a framed copy of my original patent, the one I'd filed 6 years ago when I was a postdoc, with nothing but an idea and the stubborn belief that it mattered. Next to it was a photograph of my grandfather, James Carter, who'd worked in a chemical plant in Alabama for 40 years without ever being promoted past foreman. He died before I finished my PhD, but he'd always told me the same thing. "They'll try to make you small, Elijah. Don't let them." I hadn't let them. And now I sat in a room that proved it. But victory, I was learning, is more complicated than it looks. The battles don't end when you win. They just change shape. Already, I could feel the subtle resistance from certain board members, the careful politeness that masked resentment. There would be new fights ahead, new obstacles, new people who looked at me and saw only what they expected to see. That was fine. I'd spent my entire life preparing for exactly this. My phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. "Saw the profile in Forbes. Not bad for a guy with a small role." I smiled. Outside my window, the city stretched to the horizon. Millions of people living their lives, fighting their battles, trying to find their place in a world that wasn't built for them. I thought about all the black scientists who'd come before me, whose work had been stolen, whose contributions had been erased, whose names had been forgotten. I thought about Marcus Williams and all the young people who would come after me, who would face the same obstacles and the same contempt. And I thought about what it meant to win, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd ever been told that their role was too small to matter. The truth is, there are no small roles. There are only people who refuse to see the full picture, people who underestimate, people who dismiss, people who mock. And then there's us, the ones they never saw coming. I turned back to my desk and got to work. There was a company to run, innovations to develop, and a world to change, this time on my terms.